Howdy, Earth historians. Welcome to the first podcast of the semester. I'm going to be using this format to supplement readings from the textbook and from other sources, particularly on subjects that I really can't find covered elsewhere. These things will usually last about 20 to 25 minutes, and I'll post the slides on the course website so that if you're interested in annotating them, you can download them and mark them up as you listen. You will be expected to be able to discuss these topics in class, so please be sure that you prepare and are ready. Now let's get started with today's topic. Today I'm going to talk about the nature of historical science and the logic of scientific discovery. Now on the first day of class, I said that what really makes the study of Earth history super exciting is that it gets to focus on really big questions. Questions like, where did the Earth come from? How did life originate? Essentially, how did a planet that was different in the past get to the state that we experience today? But we don't just want to ask questions, we want to be able to answer them. So how can we know anything about the past if we weren't there to see it? Most of Earth history far predates the existence of humans, let alone any direct scientific written record or observations. More broadly, we can ask, really, how can we know anything? Addressing this question is the subject of a field of philosophy called epistemology. So what I'm going to talk about today, or what I'll start off with, is a discussion of the nature of scientific knowledge. So first of all, what is science? Many people think of science as sort of a giant heap of dull, dry facts and complicated abstract theories that they had to learn about in high school. They didn't really find it very compelling or very exciting or very interesting. I mean, some of us who were science geeks really got into it, but there's plenty of people who it didn't click with them. And that's fair enough. I can actually understand very well why people, given the way that science is often presented at that level, may not be super excited about it. But here's something to consider. All of that stuff that was covered in those classes had to have come from somewhere. There must have been a point in human history when people simply didn't know what was actually being covered in that class. The real excitement, the real creativity of science comes from the process by which people can learn something genuinely new. In other words, something that no one else already knows about the material world. So I'm going to start off with, the aim of science is to build human knowledge about the material world, and that includes the history of the Earth. Now, science is limited to studying those aspects of the world that we can use our physical senses to perceive. That's what I mean about understanding the material world. Science doesn't inherently provide insight into subjects like the meaning of life, the purpose of existence, issues of good and evil, or issues of aesthetic experience. Science can influence or pose those kinds of problems. A classic example from the 20th century was the morality of using nuclear weapons after they had become technically feasible. Alternatively, science can provide answers as to why a sunset is particularly spectacularly colorful, but it can't actually tell you whether it's beautiful or not. That's just a subject that science doesn't address. Now, this is not to say that science is free of values. It's not. In fact, scientific knowledge rests on a set of very draconian and very strict values. Those values are based on the accountability of scientific claims about the material world and the underlying logic of scientific discovery. Other disciplines, like art, religion, and the humanities, are not restricted in their scope in the same way that science is, and approach the world using different standards of understanding. So what are the standards of scientific understanding for science? That question was addressed by this fellow here in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, this guy. This is Karl Popper, and in 1935 he published a book called The Logic of Scientific Discovery. He's an important philosopher in science and epistemology in the 20th century, and basically It's his thought that has laid out the basic framework for what constitutes scientific knowledge in a modern sense. So, how does science work, at least according to Karl Popper? Let's start here. First, for some reason, you, someone else, we as a whole, want to know something about the material world. Why is the sky blue? How deep is the ocean? Why are there earthquakes? Our motivation can be purely curiosity, or it can be very practical or commercial. An excellent question that is important to America's energy economy, for example, is where should I drill for oil? This is a question that can be addressed scientifically. Now, the first obvious thing to do if you have a question is to consult an authority, either a person who's particularly knowledgeable on a subject, or looking it up in a book in the library, or just simply typing it into a search engine online. If a question has already been answered, then it's not really an issue of new knowledge. So we really don't need the scientific process to address it, because essentially, if it was addressed scientifically, the science has already been done. Now, there's two things that can happen if we have a question. First, maybe we can't find an answer. Maybe no one has really addressed this, and it's a genuinely new question, or it's a question that couldn't be addressed in the past. Alternatively, maybe we can find an answer, but for some reason, we're not satisfied with it. Well, if we can't find an answer, or we're not happy with the answer that we found, we need to figure it out for ourselves. And this is the logical framework that Karl Popper set up for us. So let's say we can't find a satisfying answer. If we're approaching the world scientifically, the first thing we do is we make a guess. We start right here. We come up with an idea about how the world might work. Now, this guess should be informed by anything we already know. Existing observations, ideas from other areas of science, adaptations of previous bad guesses. We can build on previous knowledge. Based on that guess, we go from the idea down to a set of predictions. If that guess about how the world works is correct, what would you expect to see, to be able to observe in the world? And we're not just talking about stuff that we've already observed, but can you make predictions that are novel, that are new, that people have either not observed or simply not appreciated the value of the observation? You then go and look for those predicted phenomena. So, in other words, you go to the world and you make observations. In high school science, this was typically limited to experiments. An experiment is a manipulation of the world in a controlled setting. But really, any observation will work. And in geology, I have this nice image of 19th century work. You dress up in your top hat and tails, you go out with your servant and your hammer, and you bang on some rocks. That's not an experiment, because it's not in a controlled setting, and you're not manipulating the world, but you are making an observation of the world. Once we have some observations, we want to compare them to the predictions that we made based on our idea. And there's basically two possible outcomes. The first is that the observations are consistent with the predictions. That's this first option up here with the smiling dog. Your observations are the same as your predictions. Yay, you win. You were right. Your prediction was confirmed. But does this mean that your idea about how the world works was true? Well, in fact, it does not. And this is what Karl Popper insisted on. There could actually be alternative explanations that you haven't considered, that you haven't even come up with, that could potentially explain those observations about the world. You can't actually prove without a doubt, in absolute terms, that your particular idea about how the world works is correct. Now, the other possible outcome when comparing observations and predictions is that they're not consistent with each other. And this sounds like a failure of the process. Maybe even as grumpy as Grumpy Cat in this image. So, what could this mean if observations and predictions are not consistent? Well, this could mean that your guess was wrong, or it could mean that your observation is mistaken. So let's pursue this second idea first. So we're going to follow this branch up through here. In science, this outcome, that observations are bad, is checked by making sure that the observations are reproducible. In other words, anyone making the same observation or measurement should get a consistent result within the range of measurement error. Sometimes this idea of reproducibility is referred to as, quote, science being objective. But in this context, objective doesn't mean true in an absolute sense. Rather, what it means is that the observation is independent of the observer. Now, if the observations were an error, in other words, you can't reproduce them, then something is wrong with how you observed or measured the world, and you have to go back and redo it and make sure that you can get consistent data. But let's say that you check your data, and it is in fact reproducible. So that means if the observations are reproducible, that your original guess, your original prediction of what they should have been, must be wrong. And science is funny this way. You don't know the true answer based on the inconsistent observations and predictions, but you can be certain, as long as the data are reproducible in this case, that the way you thought the world worked must not be correct. So if we go back to our two possible outcomes when we compare observations and predictions, if they were consistent, it sort of suggests that we were right, but we can't be 100% sure. If they were different, but the observations are reproducible, then we can know for certain that our guess about how the world works was wrong. And that's the irony of scientific knowledge. The only place for certainty is when we reject those ideas that we know don't explain observations of the world. Now, when our guesses are correct, even though we can't be 100% certain that they are true about how the world works, we can keep using them until they result in predictions or corollaries that fail when we compare them against the material world. When they fail, we then have to reject those ideas, and we only work with those ideas that continue to give us reasonable descriptions and reasonable predictions of our measurements and observations. So scientific knowledge grows by 1. Adding new reproducible observations. 2. A trial and error process that, if it's carried out in a healthy way, constantly results in abandoning falsified explanations. And 3. Using unfalsified explanations and existing observations to make new guesses about more things. Science is not merely a rote procedure, like a lab procedure, or a compendium of facts, like a high school textbook. It's about developing genuinely new ideas, and this requires creativity and insight, even inspiration. Testing those ideas requires risking them, essentially, putting them out there so that everybody else in the scientific community can actually take pot shots at them and try to falsify them. It's hard not to take it personally. And it's this constant revision and challenge and this uncertainty in what we think we know that sort of makes Karl Popper look as grumpy as he does. A little bit like the cat, I think. There's a formal vocabulary for the different components of this scientific process that Karl Popper laid out. The first important term is hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable prediction based on an informed guess about how the world might work. Hypotheses are compared with observations, and these are referred to as data. Data are reproducible observations and measurements of the material world. In many sciences, data are acquired experimentally. An experiment is a manipulation of the world under controlled circumstances that allows us to actually generate data. I will make very clear, not all scientific data have to be experimental. For many disciplines, particularly disciplines like geology, the only way to gather data is to go out into the world and make direct observations of it, oftentimes not strictly controlled in an experimental sense. These hypotheses and data sort of come together into what's referred to as a body of theory. A theory is a coherent, internally consistent body of observations, concepts, and laws that serve as the basis for generating new hypotheses. A successful theory organizes and relates data and observations, it ties them to hypotheses and explanations, and it allows scientists to interpret and predict new phenomena that occur in the world. Most importantly, a successful theory actually shows where there are gaps in understanding. It focuses our attention on where we don't know about the world. And remember, the whole point of science is to build new knowledge. Well, you have to be able to identify those known unknowns, and that's what a theory allows you to do. Now, I used the word law when I talked about theory, and I'm going to define a scientific law as a logical statement in which one proposition, the conclusion, follows of necessity from two or more others, the premises. In logic, this is referred to as a syllogism. And essentially what I mean by law is a statement that's not a hypothesis about how the world works. It's not an observation. It's a statement that, based on the definitions of the terms in the premises, the conclusion must be true. For example, reptiles are defined as animals that don't have fur. All snakes are reptiles. Therefore, no snakes have fur. We can dispute the definition of a reptile, but if we accept those first two premises, the conclusion is inevitable. This basic framework is the reasoning that's the foundation of all modern scientific knowledge. Scientific authority must be based on this chain of logic, Popper's logic of scientific discovery. So, who decides what is or is not acceptable theory? Theory actually evolves and changes as data and ideas evolve and change. We'll see a lot of examples of this in class. So first of all, science is not a democracy. Scientific, quote, truth is not determined by some majority rule of all the scientists in the world. There are numerous instances where the majority accepted opinion regarding something about the world in science has been overturned by subsequent observations. On the other hand, if science is not simply a democracy, it's not an autocratic system either. The opinion of a single authority, no matter how bombastic or self-important or how many degrees they have, is not in fact what decides what is or is not true. Scientific hypotheses are accountable to observations. There must be a set of possible data that can falsify any given hypothesis. Scientific data are accountable to reproducibility. You should be able to get consistent results under the same circumstances independently of the identity of the observer when making observations of the world. It is this accountability to the material world and the separation from the perspective of the individual observer that distinguishes science from other ways of knowing about the world. Now, the price for adhering to this logic is that the subject matter of science is limited. You can only deal with those things that can be reproducibly observed. Nevertheless, it's this logic that underlies the entire scientific endeavor, whether it's followed explicitly or not. But we need to be aware that science is in fact a human endeavor, and therefore it's subject to all the follies and failures of the human condition. Ego, favoritism, status, greed, all of these human personality flaws can obstruct the smooth forward progress of scientific knowledge. However, ultimately, even if it takes a generation or multiple generations, ideas are in fact held to account against the data of the real world by the standards of falsifiability and reproducibility. And that's the basis, the foundation of scientific understanding of the world. So, how does all this epistemology apply to Earth history? By definition, we can't measure or observe events directly that occurred far in Earth's past. But, in fact, this problem of direct observability isn't just an issue for studying Earth history. It's very common across the sciences. For example, physicists and chemists deal with atoms and subatomic particles, like electrons and photons, that simply cannot be directly observed. No one has ever actually personally, with their own eyes, seen an individual atom. Nevertheless, given the properties of these unobservable objects, chemists and physicists can make predictions that are observable. For example, a change in the color of a chemical solution as a result of a chemical reaction, or observing the streaks on a photographic plate that's been exposed to a particle accelerator provides evidence for the existence of those particles, and the direction and shape of the paths that the particles followed and are recorded on those photographic plates can tell scientists about their properties. Rather than trying to directly observe phenomena in these examples, scientists have come up with clever ways of detecting those phenomena indirectly. This distinction between direct observation and indirect detection is critical for being able to reconstruct Earth history scientifically. When trying to reconstruct events that happened in the past, we have to predict the signature that such processes and events that affect the world will actually leave, in this case, in the geologic record, the actual record of history that accumulated through time. If we can tie these observable features to particular processes, then we can infer that those kinds of processes must have happened in the past. This process-response approach is the idea of actualism, which is more commonly stated as the principle of uniformitarianism and is first credited to James Hutton, a Scotsman who lived in the 1700s. The complicated statement of the principle of uniformitarianism is that the fundamental physical and chemical principles that we observe today must have been operating in the past, and can therefore be called upon to explain the record of past events. In a more pithy way, the present is the key to the past. In other words, the history that we reconstruct is actually a hypothesis about what happened when. As a hypothesis, this guess is accountable to the data observed in the rock record. These data don't consist of direct observations of the events of Earth history, but rather indirect detections of the record, the residue that those events have left in the rocks. The understanding as a whole, historical interpretation and rock data, is a theory of the Earth, and that's what makes historical geology a science. The next thing that we're going to need to be able to do is to put events in correct order. In other words, actually not just detect events in the past, but put them into a sequence that relates one to another through time. But that's going to be the subject of a future lecture, and before then, I will see you in class.